Hello, everyone. How are you? Welcome. It's so nice to see so many of you here. I'm Ariadna Garcia Bryce, and I teach in Spanish. I'm a member of the faculty in the Spanish department and have also taught in Human 10 a number of years, and this year I happen to be chairing it. And with me is Jan Miskowski from the German department, also a long-time Human 10er. And so we want to give you a sense of the course. I noted that this is listed as a kind of lecture where we talk at you, but really our idea is to just give you a sense of the course and then invite your questions, which we really look forward to. So I should say first off that this is a team talk course, right? So that, and it brings together lots of faculty from different disciplines, different departments, right? So as I said, Jan's in German, I'm in Spanish. We have people from the other lit and lang departments like English and French. Also, we have people from religious studies, politics, philosophy, history, and so this really speaks to or reflects the interdisciplinary nature of the course, right? And I'd say it's quite a sort of content-rich course because it brings together a broad spectrum of times and places, of cultural contexts. In the fall, it's quite focused on antiquities. And there we encompass works from ancient Egypt, ancient Persia, Israel, Greece, and then in the spring to begin with, in the first half, we focus on Mexico. All the way from like pre-conquest Nahuatl, Mexica, Mexico to well into the 20th century. So a lot there too. And then in the second part of the spring term, we focus on the Harlem Renaissance. And so that gives you a sense of, again, the wide spectrum of context that we're looking at, and within those, within the different units, we engage with, we study, we analyze all kinds of works, literary works, poetry, prose, epic poetry, lyric poetry. We also look at philosophical works, works of political thought, and histories as well. And in addition to that, we also study visual art, including architecture and sculpture, right? So again, students are engaging with lots of very different kinds of materials, and partly the idea is to have them think about how these different literary works, artistic works, political thought works, like how they're engaging with the historical and political contexts in which they're created. So just to give you an example, one of the recent classes that we had focused on a Persepolis palace complex, and there we got students to think about, or invited them to think about how this space reflected the sort of multicultural diversity of the Persian Empire in the kinds of images that and visual traditions that were present in this palace complex, right? Also getting them to think about how the way that it's designed is instigating visitors to have a kind of spatial experience that is that reflects the political agenda of the monarchy that is that has this palace constructed. So again, that's just an example of how they're learning to look at, analyze like formal features of the works that they're studying, but also relating them to a context, right? At the same time as they're thinking about works in their own context, they're also invited to think like transhistorically. So when, for example, we study the Parthenon, right? So they're thinking about how the sculptural program that they see in the Parthenon. So they're thinking about how it reflects, say, Athenian civic pride at the same time as Athenian political anxieties. Apart from that, they're also invited to like telescope out and think about and compare how some of our modern monuments make political meaning, right? So really invited to think again of works in context and also telescope out. Another interesting thing about the course is that, as you can imagine, we don't just think about each cultural context sort of in a void, but are very interested in how cultures are influencing each other, right? So that we have kind of a multi-perspectival lens on the works that we study. Recently, for example, when we read, study, analyze Herodotus's histories, right? So the Greek historian Herodotus, and he talks a lot about Persia, right? And so at the same time, sort of sandwiched between the classes on Herodotus, students also are going to study monuments from Persia, where they get to see a perspective on Persian political culture that is different from what you get through the foreign eyes of Herodotus. So just a sense of how they're not just reading within one context, but also unpacking how each of these contexts, cultural contexts, is also alive with all these different other influences, right? So with that, that gives you a sense of the content of the course, which I should say includes both a lecture component, because they listen to about 3 lectures a week, and also a kind of seminar discussion. So with that, I will turn this over to Jan, who will have more to say about other aspects of the course.
Okay, how's the volume? Can you hear me? Okay. So basically the division of labor was essentially, Ariadne was going to talk to you about the content, and then I'm going to talk to you about the skills. What do you actually learn to do in this class? Now, if you were to go to the READ website, there is a nice 4-bullet point summary of what you supposedly learned skill-wise in this course. So it's you learn to craft, analyze, critique, and defend arguments using evidence. You learn to express ideas in writing persuasively. You learn to frame questions that elicit productive analysis. And you learn to contribute constructively to a classroom discussion. Now, that sounds like boilerplate for accreditation agencies, which it is, and it also sounds really dull in that form. So, in that spirit, I thought what I would do, and that said, it's all true. That is what you learn in this class, but it's more interesting when it's not formulated quite that way. So I thought what I would do is actually just go through 4 challenges that I see as a faculty member in this course and describe the tensions, sort of the obstacles, if you will, to the students learning these skills. Why isn't it just self-evident, simply a trivial matter to acquire all these skills and move on happily? So the first thing I was thinking about in this context, when you first come to college, there's a very fine line between being empowered and being humble. On the one hand, and on the one, I don't just say this because you're the parents, but on the one hand, I really have great admiration for the students that I teach. I think they're, extraordinarily able. They're extremely creative. They bring all sorts of interesting perspectives and energies to bear on the topics. But at the same time, I'm very sort of aware as a teacher, when you first come to college, if you think you already know everything, you're in big trouble. And I remember this very well. When I was in college, I remember I had friends who said like, oh, well, Plato, well, I did that in 10th grade in high school. Or, and these were actually people who, many of them had gone to, extremely fancy prep schools and so forth. They really had been told they'd already mastered all the material. So when they came to college, there was no sense of, well, I have anything to learn. And it's difficult because they might think that about the humanities. No one would ever think that about chemistry or mathematics or physics, right? Like no first year in college thinks, I know physics. But a lot of them think, well, I read books. Well, I know what movies I like. I know what art I like. So there's a certain challenge as their teacher in this course where on the one hand you're saying to them, you have many skills, you have all sorts of abilities. I have great confidence in the kind of work you can do. And on the other hand, you're having to say to them, but don't get ahead of yourself. Don't really think you're in a far better position to learn the less you think you understand. And so that's both as a teacher but also as a student experiencing that. That's difficult because of course sometimes it is really discouraging when you realize how little you learn. And then you start again as a sophomore and you realize you still don't know anything and so on and so on. But on the other hand, that's also what's exciting. So as a faculty member, that's something that I'm always trying to finesse in a certain way in this class. I guess the second thing I would say is if you really ask me what do I hope my students come away from this class, there's just one thing. It's have they learned how to learn what any text has to teach them. And I will freely admit, and I know this is true for all the students and all the faculty, nobody loves everything we assign on the syllabus. Right? This is a team-taught course. By definition, it's all compromise. There are certain things on the syllabus where, frankly, I find them boring to teach. But what I do believe about everything on the syllabus is there's something to learn from it. And that skill, if as a student you can learn how to figure out what any text, be it a verbal text, work of art, what have you, what it can teach you, then you're really you're extraordinarily well positioned, not just in your future academic career, but just in life in general. And the anecdote I often think in this regard that really crystallized this for me once was many years ago, we taught a Roman text by Tacitus, which was about the sort of Roman invasion of Germania, the German tribes and such. Like if you've seen Gladiator, this is like the beginning of Gladiator. So we read this text, and the next day there was a student in class who was assigned to give a presentation about it. And so the student comes in, they sit down, they give this presentation. And when they were done, after 10 minutes, one of the students said, last night when I was reading this, I thought it was the most boring thing ever. And now having heard your 10-minute spiel, I realized how amazing it is. And that, to me, was the kind of, sort of transformative moment where someone realizes, I read something and I didn't know how to understand what was cool about it. And now my peer, not my teacher, this was also great, my peer has shown me there's so much more to this than I realized. And I really feel that even on a sort of minute-to-minute level in class. I can see that at times. We can be discussing something and it'll be obvious certain people just aren't that engaged. And then someone will say something about it and suddenly they'll realize, oh, and there's all this potential there. So that's the second thing I would say is, I really hope when my students come away from this class that they have learned how to learn from all the texts we teach them. And the third thing I would just talk about is to do with writing, partly because writing is such a central skill in all venues. When students first come to college, I see in many ways my first major task is unteaching them what they were taught in high school about writing. And it's often a really long and protracted process. And the reason I partly put the blame, it took me many years to understand this, but I partly put the blame on AP English. So, and I know you say, wait, I was all excited. My child got an A in AP English or 5 on the AP exam, whatever. Great, but the problem with AP English is it prepares you to take a certain exam. And the exam encourages a certain kind of analysis and a certain kind of, getting a certain kind of set of questions right in what you write about the thing they put in front of you. And unfortunately, this exam teaches people a lot of really bad suppositions about the nature of writing. So the example, it's always very clear and very graphic. The very first paper you write in this course, you are given, there's one paper topic, we call it a prompt. Everyone gets the same prompt, so the entire first-year class has this one prompt. And the students look at it, and their immediate reaction, you can see sort of the wheels turning, and they're thinking to themselves, okay, so what's the right answer? Like, as in, on the AP exam, I will be graded, and I will have said blah, 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 and I'll get full credit for my answer. What do I need to say here to get the answer? And one of the first things I have to sort of say and jump up and down about is, there isn't a right answer. To the contrary, hopefully, there are 500 wonderful papers that could be written on, maybe 5,000 on the basis of this prompt. And indeed, no two students in the first-year class will write the same paper. But what they need to understand is that's a good thing, not a bad thing. If we gave them a question where everyone wrote the same paper, then we completely failed in that sense. But it's hard. It is something really hard to unteach when you've been taught that you get credit for your writing for hitting a certain set of points, like the bullet points I began with. So that's another challenge in this course is teaching students. And going back to my earlier anecdote about the Tacitus, what I often say to students is when you're writing a paper, imagine we've all read the same poem, right? We've all read the same poem, but now you show us something about this poem that none of us else, the rest of us noticed. We all read the same thing, but you're going to show us something we all missed. And if you just do that, that sounds like a small thing, but that's actually an enormous contribution. And ultimately, that's what scholarship in a very broad sense is. I guess the last thing I would say, it pertains to the last bullet point I read, which is contribute constructively to classroom discussion. One of the things I really think this course teaches students is, in many ways in college, you learn the most from your peers. You learn more from your peers, in a way, than you do from your professors. Which you might say, well, why is that? Well, in a community, and again, your parents, you went to college, you can remember this. I mean, you go to class and you talk about something for 50 minutes. But then you go and everybody else you know and live with and eat with and, play tennis with or what have you, all of you, it's an odd example since we don't have tennis courts on campus, but anymore, I'm not bitter. But you live and breathe this stuff the other 23 hours of the day you're not in class. And really what's amazing, I mean, this sounds like, some sort of, I don't know, an anecdote for the admissions office or something, but I remember like a couple weeks ago we were talking about Homer's Iliad, and I left class and I went off and did some things, and then 2.5 hours later, I came back to the building where my office is, where the classroom was, and 3 of the students from the class were sitting on the steps still arguing over what we'd done in class. And they're going to be so proud. They're going to be so proud that I told you all this. And then they're going to say, how much extra credit do we get? So, and I'm going to say, you don't get extra credit, you get regular credit. That's what we expect. But it really is the case because every student in this college takes this course. From the moment you get here, you're part of a discussion that literally includes everybody on the campus, right? And it's not, I mean, students often tell me, students in first year of college often tell me, I was talking about this text the other day with someone who's a junior, because of course they'd read the same text. Or I know someone who's a senior who says their thesis was influenced by the thing we were just talking about in this second week of college, that kind of thing. So you're really genuinely part of a conversation. And that's a very exciting thing. So I think I will stop there. As you said, we are really, primarily here to hear your questions, to hear your comments, and go wild. Yeah, someone, right away, someone has a hand. They want you to have a microphone, but maybe you should wait.
Maybe we can hear you. I don't know.
Can you can talk loud?
I super appreciate everything you shared, everything, the multiple perspectives you're highlighting, the trans-historical intention, the commitment to dialogue and conversation and learning itself. And I should further say that my daughter so far loves reading. So I just would like you to know that right up front. With all that said, though, I did take a look at the syllabus for Hum 110. And I have to say candidly, I was shocked and slightly appalled by what I perceive as a huge gap or chasm of missing Asia in the understanding of the foundations of human inquiry. So obviously, I haven't been, well, I should add to that, not only geographical gap, if you will, but I'm just going to call it an approach to what makes knowledge, right? Which could even include topics in the anthropology of thought or the sociology of thinking and so forth. And so obviously, I haven't been at Reed for all these fantastic meetings where I'm convinced, I'm positive that you have all considered this question very deeply, probably for many years. And I'm speculating that probably part of the solution or part of the approach was that you're a small college. We are a small college. And so you wanted to do well. You have an ethical duty to do well what you do at all. And so perhaps you felt a necessity to limit the scope of what is taught. So I'm just wondering what the latest thinking is about that. And I don't think it takes any genius of any measure to recognize that so many world events of the last 30 to 50 years have revolved around cultural misunderstandings. I think that the USA severely misunderstood the intentions of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, for example. I think that to understand the current opioid crisis in the USA, including the contribution of China, I think it would be wise to understand the opium wars. And so I think there are many, many ways in which this multi-perspectivalism of a foundation's curriculum, to be true to that spirit, needs to expand itself, is my opinion. And I would wonder if you would be so kind as to share some thoughts on that.
So I can begin. I don't know that I don't have a satisfying answer, because I don't think there is a satisfying answer, right? I think that you mentioned that this is a small college and that one cannot have coverage of everything, right? But so there are sort of gaping absences, right, in the syllabus. All I can say is that it does, as much as it does not integrate much very significant material, right? You mentioned the absence of a whole sort of continent there, right? It does try to engage students in thinking about the fact that that cultures are fluid, and also that boundaries, right? Cultural boundaries can, are things that are negotiated, and that there's, cultural exclusions are things that are, decided arbitrarily. So I think that they are learning skills that might help them reach the conclusion that you are reaching, right? But I do agree that there are significant absences, right? And that one might say as well that if one were to try to cover all of the important things out there, we would also necessarily be making individual units much more meager, right? So that would mean that you could spend less time, right, within one cultural framework. So, and some of the things that the students do is they work intertextually as well, right? So how do these texts from this context speak to each other? So then I don't think either we would want it to be a course where we're doing just one text from here and one text from there, right? So I say that, I just sort of put to you my reactions, which are, which are for now what I can think about. But yeah, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think your points are all really well taken. I guess I'd just say as background, there's two things to think about. This course in North American education is extremely unusual in that everyone has to take it. It's very common you would go to college and have to take some set of first-year seminars that would, deal with the humanities, but you would by definition have choice. and what's unusual, right, about Hum 110 is you don't have choice. And what that means is, by default, anything we put on the syllabus, we are de facto saying this is worthy of consideration and potentially more worthy than anything else, as in all 99.9% of human productivity that isn't on the syllabus. Now, I think most people would say symbolically that's true, but that's not really the message of the course. I would certainly say, if you asked me, could you change every text on this course tomorrow and the course could still do what it needs to do? I'd say sure. Right? There's nothing, and I should say though, that hasn't been necessarily the dominant view for a very long time. Certainly when I first started at Reed, there were senior faculty who would just say quite outright, take positions that I think today would seem bizarrely Eurocentric or worse, where they would simply say, you have to teach this, this, and this, because this is the foundations of thought. I don't think any faculty would, I certainly would never dream of saying that today, but it wasn't too long ago that people were taking that position. And so that's just something to think about as background. I think the other thing is, there's always in this course been this tension between, are we teaching content or are we teaching skills? I've always leaned much more towards the skill side. That's what I mean by saying, I think you could change all the text and we can still do the class. But then the question becomes, well, are you saying the content is arbitrary? Well, no, obviously not. And then how do you make these selections? Now, the way the college, and this is not an excuse, but the way the college has tried to somehow grapple with this problem is by creating a multi, sort of stage humanities sequence. So this is the one foundational course. There are then second year 200 level humanities courses that do, address some of the gaps in this syllabus. But that said, of course, the immediate rejoinder is, well, but those aren't required and only a tiny fraction of the class ever takes them. Absolutely the case. And in fact, it's painful in certain respects what small numbers of people take some of these other humanities courses. One would love it if they were they were more robust. So that's another consideration. I mean, the other thing to realize is even it was only relatively recently that the Americas even figured in the Hume curriculum at all. Right? When I first started at Reed, there was no humanities course, no general humanities course that anything from the Americas, including Greenland, was even on the syllabus. So there's been a lot of change. But certainly your concerns are concerns that I think many faculty share and many faculty vocalize.
Hi there. I am also a very enthusiastic parent of a senior, and I very much recall her taking this course and just lighting up talking about it, so I appreciate it. My question is about what you've seen in terms of the last couple of years, this being a group of young people who, in their formative years, high school that is, were in COVID and in shutdown mode and on screens with no interaction and not in classrooms. My sense from talking to my student is that there wasn't a real sense of dialogue that was easy. Now, that was different when I went to college because we all were blabbermouths in the 80s. But I just wonder if that's shifted now that COVID is, 5 years behind us, 4 years behind us? If you've seen a change in that skill of being able to dialogue. And in particular, I'm glad to hear that is emphasized because all you have to do is go to a city council meeting. I happen to be in that realm these days in my neighborhood to watch how people cannot talk to each other. They cannot have, useful, peaceful dialogues without insulting each other, without sort of dominating. And I've heard this just in conversations with her about, like in some classes, teachers really work to have kids be able to talk, and just wondered how you approach that in Hume 101. But I also, so there's two questions. Have you seen a shift, and how do you encourage students? And thank you so much.
Yes, I have seen a shift. again, I noticed around the COVID era there was perhaps less habituation to being in a social space. I think I get a sense that's changed now. Certainly, I have talkative students, right? I think that that said, right, although these in the discussion groups, the conferences, they very, very much are student-centered, right? So it's students who are weighing in with their interests and so on. Obviously, they vary, right, in how comfortable they feel talking. So I think different people among us do different things, right? I think that one thing is to have to really open up the discussion by not having it at the start center on questions that I generate. So there's definitely stuff that I want students to know, but typically at the start of the discussion, right, the table is really open to and inviting and encouraging just open-ended thoughts, right? And then we start threading, right, like common patterns, like you said this and you said this, so that people start establishing those threads. But one thing that helps is to start very broadly, so that students are jumping into the discussion from where they're at, because each of them is going to have a different starting point and a different window into a text or an artwork, depending on what their own sort of high school background is, their own kind of character, right? Some of them are shyer than other things that we do, or I do, for example, is have them do group presentations, right? So they get together on their own in group presentations, and then they present to the group, and that helps everybody, come with something definite to say. So constantly kind of mixing up the techniques to have students, become involved and maintain themselves involved in class discussions, right? Also always inviting them to weigh in with like their take on lecture, for example, right? So that they're invited to have like their own critical lens on how we're grappling with the material, right? So it's not just that they're being evaluated, but we're very much not, we're not infantilizing them. We really are inviting them to engage at a critical level with us, right? Like, how do you, what were you convinced by in this lecture? What were you not convinced by, right? So hopefully that is also incentivizing their interests, right? If they're really interested in and engaged, they will weigh in, right? So
it's interesting. I had a conversation recently with a 6th grade teacher, and it's clear to me that everybody in education at every level is always doing the calculation when a new group of students walks in, how old were they during COVID? And what are the impacts? And honestly, I have to tell you, I obviously the impacts, I'm sure you could probably understand them better than I could, but I don't know exactly what I think happened. And, if you were in 8th grade as opposed to 9th grade or 5th, I truly don't know. One thing I would say, though, and listening also to what Ariadne was just saying, to me, what I always take heart in a certain way is there's a lot of common ground intellectually and culturally, obviously, but intellectually between our students. And so during COVID, I actually taught a class, a Hume 110 conference. Everyone's masked in a room that seats 200 people. It's a chapel, has very good acoustics, so everybody's spread out. 15 people are spread out across this room that seats 200 in masks. And you might think, okay, how is that possible that you could have any kind of intellectual community in that context, literally shouting across a room? Well, one thing the college had done at the time was they said, well, we're going to try to group these people in these conferences by interests. And it just by random, it so happened, everybody in my group, they all were people who thought they were going to major in political science. And I was told that. So that means I can go in drawing on the fact that, well, I know the background, at least they have some common ground, they're all interested in political science. And that then became a kind of, whatever you want to say, a fulcrum or a sort of starting point for us to actually have a kind of unified experience, even under these bizarre physical conditions. And honestly, I remember that conference and what happened in that conference and the sort of the intensity of the exchanges and the conversations and the camaraderie between the students as being as strong as any other I've ever taught, even just sitting around a table. So that's an example of something that actually happened in the time. But I also I have a sense people are resilient. Like I think, I think if there's anything, that's the lingering effect on campus, there's a certain, how should I say, I think it's still a little too atomized. I think people are still a little too much in their rooms. They're a little too much in their cubicles. They're a little, I think there used to be more, obviously you go to the cafeteria, there's a kind of collective din. But that used to be, it felt to me a little more prominent on campus. I think we're still recovering from that. But I do think it's going in the right directions. Here's one.
This might be a follow-up to the previous question. Each student has their own sort of stylistic approaches when it comes to discussions, especially with class discussions. They might need a bit more time to process what's being discussed. One might perhaps say that the students who would tend to speak up more might be encouraged to speak up less, whereas those who don't really emerge from their shells might need some encouragement. So this has more to do with skills than content.
Sure.
Do the faculty who facilitate these discussions talk about these issues and the different stylistic, approaches? Maybe some people are more writerly than verbal, that sort of thing. So my daughter is, I think, more writerly, and she's been encouraged repeatedly to come out of her shell. So we're torn, though. Do we need that in a society that perhaps, values the different stylistic approaches of individuals? Or are you looking for a homogeneity in your class where everyone is essentially equally participating and equally writerly? So I know that's a tension, maybe you don't have an answer, but I wanted to know whether you talk about that.
I think we talk about it all the time. And that's one thing I realized coming to Reed very quickly is the faculty here think about those kinds of questions constantly, and they talk about them constantly. And so the sort of the reservoirs of wisdom that one can draw on from one's colleagues are enormous. In terms of your question, no, I don't think we want homogeneity. I entirely agree there are certain students you wish you could turn the dial down a little bit. Or to put it this way, you wish they would think a few seconds, not that they're not eloquent, not that they're not smart, not that they're, but they would think a few seconds and decide, is this the right moment to intervene? Because the opposite kind of student, there are many students who, they tell me often, I'm sitting there, I think of all these really cool things, but by the time I formulated it, we've moved on. And so, how does one address that? I think one thing you do, and I recommend to students, is when you're doing the readings, which are vast, and take notes. Because what some people are really, really good at is sort of random access memory. Like a topic will come up and someone will be like, oh yeah, that was like last night in the reading in chapter 3, da-da-da-da-da. And everyone else sits there going, wait, how did they access that so quickly? Well, the point is, if while you were reading chapter 3 that night, there was some cool thing and you made a note of it, then when it comes up in class, then you too can immediately access it, even if that's not how your brain works. And so I don't think My concern is not that every student talk every time. My concern is not that everyone talk the same amount. My concern is that people feel like they can make the contributions they want to make and that they will be heard when they make them. But that said, just yesterday I was talking to a colleague, not teaching in Hume, but who was sort of saying like, it's such a shock sometimes when you get the first paper in a class and you realize, whoa, this person is Aristotle, and yet they've never said a word. It's that kind of thing where you're just like, whoa. There are moments of that, and again, I think in the greater horizon, that's fine too. You can do that. You can write amazing papers and not be a big voice in class if that works for you. I don't think that's a failing necessarily. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree. I would echo that, and I would say as well that certainly in my class I emphasize a lot listening, right? I am very conscious, as you are, that this is maybe a society that codes like talking as more active than listening, where arguably you can listen extremely actively, right, and be really enriched by that, and that if you're a really good listener, you'll probably have a lot more to say, right? So I think that when I talk about encouraging students to talk, it's more in the vein of what Jan is saying, of making them feel that they really can share those thoughts, because often they want to. I don't think that the quieter ones hold back just because they don't care or that they're fine with it, right? But that said, right, the goal isn't to get everybody talking the same amount of time. We're not clocking people, right? I think that people really feel valued for the strengths that they have. So,
the other thing I often try to stress to students is just, nobody's majoring in the humanities, right? This is a course you have to take, but in a certain sense you have a safety net, right? Like this is a place to take risks. Sometime when you're in the junior seminar of your chosen major, when you intervene, you'll want to sound like you really know what's going on. You won't want to speak before thinking. In humanities, right, as I say, you have a certain leeway here. It's like, take risks, try things out. Nobody's mastered all of these things. And so use this as an opportunity to practice so that, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, when you want to, be as sort of eloquent and adroit as you can possibly be in, your senior seminar or something like that, you'll have the skills in place. So it's really just, again, there's a safety net here. There are no great consequences to falling. You can get up and fall again. Sorry, you want to?
And maybe this is even kind of a follow-up to what you're already talking about. But what is the structure for, talking in class? I mean, are there boundaries with regard to crosstalk, responding, so that people do feel safe, sharing what they have and not feeling like it's a debate, but more just collaborating?
So I guess everyone does different things, right?
There are
like 24 classes, so I cannot give you a panoramic. I can say that, like in my class at the start, I do talk about that. It's important that to really listen to one another carefully and respect what people say, without that meaning that you hold back on your own opinions, right? Because we want people to be able to have an honest dialogue. I think that you can have both honest and respectful dialogue. So I sort of outright say that at the start. And there isn't a set framework, because I think that would sort of make the class feel kind of automatic if there were kind of order, right? I mean, this conversation is necessarily sort of fluid and spontaneous, and it goes in directions that you don't know from the start, right? I mean, that's sort of the whole point of the seminar, the seminar format, right? But what we can do, obviously, if as in my case, again, everyone's different. If a student has been monopolizing the word too much, it's easy enough to deflect. I will say, well, I would like to hear from someone else, right? So you kind of address it as it happens, so that people can maintain that spontaneity, but also feel like there's not someone completely monopolizing the conversation and other people who are sort of excluded, right?
One thing I would say also to this is, in my experience, Reed students are on average very polite. I'm just frequently struck by it, that they're very, I really enjoyed what you just said, and there's a lot of politesse, so it's not a scrum by and large. They certainly seem more polite than when we were in college, don't you think?
I guess, yeah.
But the other thing I would say is, it's very interesting. Once a colleague told me something I tried, which is we took this giant ball of blue string, and the first person who spoke held the end of the string, and then if you spoke, we threw you the ball, and then the next person who spoke, we threw the ball. And it went around the room, and eventually, actually, it was more interesting ultimately as an art installation, because basically you had 14 people in a room all holding ends of string that had formed in this incredible pattern. But the point is, you could see the pattern of the conversation. You could see who'd talked 5 times and who'd only talked once. You could sort of visualize it. And I think that was actually very informative for everyone to sort of see how it unfolded graphically. There's someone in the balcony who wants to talk.
What are the assignments?
Oh, yeah.
I see.
Assignments? No.
Oh, there are no assignments.
Yeah.
They have, apart from the reading, right, which again is mostly primary texts, but they do get some secondary, like scholarly articles about, for example, an artwork, right, when it's an artwork day or an architecture day, right? So apart from all of the reading that they do, they have 4 different papers in the fall, and then 3 in the spring. Papers between like 5, 6, 7 pages each, and so again 4 papers and 3 papers, and then there's a final exam, and there's a 3-hour final exam at the end of each term that covers all of the material, and the exam is formatted in part as ID, so they have to, in the one section, sort of close read an excerpt from a text or an image or an architecture work, and then write 2 different essays, commentary essays, some of them comparative, on how these different texts address some of the larger themes of the course, right? So those are their writing assignments, and then we meet up with them after each essay that they write, and we talk about their process, and we get them to begin to develop a kind of self-awareness of where they are as writers and where they want to go, and again we help them develop those writing skills.
Over here.
Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today. I looked over the syllabus, and there's a lot of material, right? No way I could get through all that in one school year. So hoping for a pro tip from each of you. Can you recommend, like, the one book that maybe I can get through 2 by the end of the school year?
Do you have a one book?
That you can skip?
Oh, what? Do you want to?
Are you saying to read one book to read? I thought you meant what's the one book you can blow off to have more time. And then my thought was one, but yeah.
I'll just add, I'm Aurora, do parent engagement. We do have a Q110 parent book club. It's starting up again in January, so we work with the faculty.
Wait, so what's the one? Invisible Man is pretty good.
You like Invisible Man? I like it.
I don't know.
Jan likes Invisible Man.
Have you read this novel? I mean, it's what's extraordinary about it is just you read 100 pages of it and you feel like you've read 5 novels, and then you realize there's 400 more pages. I mean, it's no, that you wouldn't. Let's put it this way: I can recommend it to you, and I can be confident you will not be disappointed. Why? What do you like?
I don't know. Can I admit I really like the pre-Socratic fragments, like the Heraclitus.
I think you just did. In front of a whole room.
They're short.
Yeah.
They're short. They're just very interesting.
I mean, Zora Neale Hurston is again another one I can recommend. I can't imagine you'd be disappointed. Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's another book. Yeah, Plato, though. It's always fun.
Yeah.
Sure.
We used to do the symposium. Now, the Republic. I mean, it's fun to read the Republic often. It's read just as philosophical text, but we get to reread it as right after we read the history of the Peloponnesian War. So they're thinking about it in the context of like the crisis of democracy. So that's interesting as well. It's kind of a heavy read, right? But it's interesting. It's great fun to talk about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks so much. I participate in the parents' Hume class, and I'm terribly behind on my reading. But I wanted to ask, so I really appreciate your comment about skill building, and it's secondarily about the content itself. And I was very interested in understanding really the feedback that you give to the students. Is one of the charms of Read that, you don't get a letter grade, you get this dialogue about their growth. And I'm just curious what you can tell us about that.
And I should say this really is a very distinctive thing. Like colleagues at other schools, when they understand that you don't put the grade on the paper, but you have to write enough on it that you communicate your message, they blanch. I mean, it's but I mean, Ariadne already mentioned, after each paper, you meet individually with the students in a paper conference. And that in itself is an interesting institution, because of course anybody anywhere can go talk to the professor in office hours, but when it's sort of routinized in this way, sort of ritualized, the students come to take it very seriously, and they have to, they're aware they have to go in with some account of what they think they were doing. And the dialogues, the other thing is you get to know the students very well intellectually. You do this 2 or 3 times with them, you really do know how they work, how they think, in a very individualized way. So that's exciting. But, to be honest, giving paper, like writing comments on papers is something, I think it's something I don't think you ever finish learning how to do it. Like I'm always finding something where I think, aha, now I've innovated. Now I know how to communicate the message better. And then next year I'll have another trick. So I think as a faculty member, it's an ongoing thing. And maybe it's also to say, partly as the students change, the way I communicate has to change too. So.
Yeah, and essays are really so different. It's so interesting how people's thought process are very different, and that's so differently captured in language, right? So yeah, just ditto on what you just said, how we're also constantly navigating new ways of continuing to teach writing. Some of the students, and the students also, you take the cue from the students, because some students come in and they really want very concrete sort of technical advice, right? That how do I craft an introduction, right? Others of them have more kind of open-ended, like how do I think about this text, right? So you kind of it's a two-way conversation, right? Students don't come in and say nothing and then you declamate, right? It's more that this varies. In my case, they get the first word because they've read my comments, right? So they know they have to come in with what their response to my comments is, right? Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? Like, where do you think that Ariadne, got wrong what you were saying, right? So that way, I think that also introduces an extra level of self-awareness as well.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments today. My question has to do with what is the nature of the student voices in helping construct and reconstruct the syllabi and the curriculum at Reed, both in this sequence of courses, but also maybe more broadly based on your experience?
Well, I mean, historically, in the recent history speaking, this course, was it now 8 years ago, 7 years ago?
I remember how long
6,
it was.
7, 8 years ago, this course was radically altered. And the real impetus for that was sustained student protest. Sort of systematically. And it was very unusual. Like, there's lots of student protests in North America. It's not uncommon. What was uncommon was these protests were actually disrupting the class. So the lectures, this was back before COVID, the lectures were held live in this hall. Students would come and sit and protest in front of the speaker. And this went on for a year or more. And that was in conjunction with a lot of sort of, we call it student militancy. I don't know, you want to say militating for certain positions with respect to the curriculum. But the students played, that would not have happened. The extent of the changes, there's no way they would have transpired without this enormous push from the students. And very sustained push. It wasn't one speak out, it wasn't one poster set, it was like over a long, protracted period of time. So in that very concrete sense, they had an enormous influence.
Can you expand upon what the actual foundation of the protest was? Was it to the content?
Yes, content is too Eurocentric. It was too, basically, it was just very old-fashioned. Like when I started in this class, it was basically Greece, Rome, and the Hebrew Bible. And this is a course you could have taught in the 1930s. And you would, this is a course that, white men would have taught to their all-male white classes in college in the 1930s, and you would have learned, the syllabus looked bizarrely unreconstructed. Now I'm being a little unfair. There were some tweaks, but that was the charge. And the response was, now the second half of this course that was the introduction of the Americas. Now the second half, the first quarter of the spring is
Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico, basically the Spanish encounter with the, Mesoamerica and then subsequent history of Mexico. And then the second quarter is the Harlem Renaissance. But that's, the students can justly take credit for that, and not for exactly what the changes were, but that such large changes that if you told me 2 years before those protests, something will happen and you'll change half the syllabus, I would have bet you any amount of money that would never happen. Because in a team talk course of this sort, change is bizarrely incremental. So this was a case where it really was intervention from the outside, and the staff finally said, all right, we got to do something different. One more question.
I apologize, I came up, so you've already addressed this. But I wonder how you're thinking about AI and this one default and one is the writing intensive.
You're trying to ignore AI.
Oh.
No.
Well,
no,
Well, I'm wondering if actually, thank you. I'm wondering if this conference approach that you have, right, so that's quite different, a student having to come and defend each piece of work that they're doing helps mitigate against temptation.
Okay.
So, I do think sometimes faculty underestimate the challenge, because people think, if you just tell ChatGPT to write a paper about X, it'll be pretty obvious ChatGPT wrote it. But if you're somewhat cannier about telling it exactly what to do and how it needs to do it, you can produce something that gets much more difficult to simply determine it wasn't entirely your own work. I guess the first thing is, I said on the first day of class this year, I said, learning to write is not some, random skill like learning to change a tire on a car or learning to, ride a bike or something like that even. Learning to write is learning to think. And the same way, if someone does your math problems for you, you'll never learn to think that way. If someone does your chemistry for you, you'll never learn to think that way. If someone does your writing for you, you're not learning to think, full stop. Now, if you're okay with that, but that's really the stakes. It's not, don't kid yourself that it's like, well, the lawnmower mows the grass faster than I could by hand. That's not the analogy. If you're not, and I say also to students, if you're not sitting down and like breaking your soul trying to get the sentence right, you're not learning, right? And so that's something I said at the beginning of class. I've had relatively few what seemed to me egregious violations in this regard. Most interesting was last year I had a student who was clearly using AI to write her papers. And she wouldn't admit it. I finally said, come on, this is silly. Like, someone who didn't know English from 100 miles away could see that a human being didn't write this paper. And she said, yeah, no, you're right. She's like, I open my laptop, the AI's right there, that's just what I do. And I said, okay, look, close your laptop, take a pen, take a piece of paper, and write a paper. And she said, all right. And she did it, and the paper she wrote was 10 times better than any of the papers the AI had written. So I was like, see? And then she said, yeah, but it took so long.
Right, exactly. I mean, in the vein of what you're saying, I do something, I say something along those lines. Like, people usually think that language is just like reproducing the idea you have, right? Whereas often the language comes before the idea. And if they really understand that, I think they'll understand the stakes of what they're doing, right? And then I'm in Jan's camp as well, that, they're adults. If they want to really learn, it behooves them to do it. That said, I haven't had no cases of AI that I know of in U110. I've had them in Spanish. It's sometimes easier to spot, you might say, but yeah, I really have a strong sense that no, that this has not been an issue so far, right? I do know that AI is getting better each time, right? But hopefully, right, the reason will prevail.
I think the other thing to realize is I don't think students, and it depends also what educational background you come from, I've had some students where I don't think they thought it was cheating, right? I mean, some of them had come from other countries, and they'd come from like basically exclusively STEM backgrounds. And it didn't make sense. So, for example, like brainstorming, like, here's a topic, what am I going to write about it? Well, I'll ask ChatGPT what I can maybe write about it. I don't think they thought they were cheating. And again, that's something I have to say to them. No, look, I understand trying to figure out what you're going to do is misery. But that's the task, right? If you don't do it, you'll never learn how. Just the same way you can have been an academic for 50 years. You're always refining this talent, but you're only doing it if you're doing it. Another analogy I do think is more accurate is, if you go to the weight room and, you set the weight so that you're only lifting 10% of the weight, you're not training, And it's sort of the same thing here. If you're using ChatGPT to brainstorm for your topic, you're not doing the work.
You're not in college.
No, you're not. But I don't know. But I would, honestly, my colleagues across the country are in real state of consternation about this, because people tell me it's so many different schools, and not enormous public schools, the most elite private schools. They say the incidence of the use of this is so high, and they don't know what to do. They're literally back to, they only give assignments where you write it by hand in a blue book in class, and even that, there's a whole bunch of contingencies that make it really hard. But that has become more and more of an industry norm. And it's happened very, very fast. It's kind of shocking. So.
On that cheery note, thank you all so much.
Thank you.